Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, committee. So this is actually a fascinating topic. At least I find it fascinating. I know that we've had an opportunity to speak with many of you individually about this proposal. And what I hope to provide for today is a demonstration that there are inherent flaws in the way that we as a state and we as a country award our electoral votes to elect the President of the United States. And it's not necessarily to point blame at anybody, but just to explain that the way that the rules are set now, there are a lot of unintended and problematic consequences from that. So to understand why we're even proposing this, we kind of need to go back in time and go back to the Constitutional Convention to understand where did our Electoral College come from. So at the Constitutional Convention, our founding fathers had to decide, how do we choose the president? There's lots of different ways to do it. One of the ideas was to let Congress elect the president. But as we heard from our previous presenter, the checks and balances that are carefully placed in our system currently, if we had Congress electing the president, he wouldn't necessarily have been able to check Congress as much because he would be dependent upon them for his power. So that idea did not win support during the Constitutional Convention. The second idea was to let the state legislatures elect the president. Now, I'm sure we would love that today as a state legislature, but our founding fathers also determined that might, in the precarious discussion between balancing the power of the states and the power of the federal government, that might lend too much power to the states, and so they decided not to move forward with that. So a third idea came up, which was to let the people directly elect the president. And that was actually a policy that James Madison supported. But there were two cross currents two political considerations that the states had that prevented that from moving forward. One was that you had large states and small states, population-wise, there was that consideration. But the second consideration also dealt with the issue of slavery and the balancing of the North and the South and the slave and the free states and their power in Congress. And so the slave states, because they had fewer voters, they were concerned that they would be swept under the rug by the North states with a popular vote. So the popular vote was not able to work at our founding due to that situation, and so we came up with the Electoral College. So the Electoral College, obviously, it gives each state 2 votes plus the votes for its representatives in the House. So just one factoid there, the system was decided upon after about 22 days of deliberation. And then once they decided on the Electoral College, they had to figure out how do we have those votes cast? Who does that and how is it done? And they couldn't decide. Ultimately, they couldn't figure it out. They thought, well, maybe we'll let the legislature choose, or it was complicated and they couldn't come to a conclusion. So they just said, let's let the legislature determine however they want to do it. It's a federalist kind of a policy, and we'll let the states decide. We don't want to figure it out or force that policy upon them at the national level. So that's where we are today. If we look at the Constitution, Article 2, Section 1, each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors. And that's our Electoral College. We have the 12th Amendment, which makes a couple clarifications to that, but in essence, we decide as a state, as a legislature, however we want that to occur today. So once the Electoral College was established, George Washington was president. There weren't really political parties within our country at that time. There were sort of, the seeds of them had been planted. And George Washington was a shoo-in for 2 terms. However, at the end of his term, there was a race between Adams and Jefferson. And so some of the states had electors that ran on the ballot. So they would be voted on as either a candidate that supported one presidential person or another, or one presidential candidate or another. And then the people would vote on that elector, and then that elector would vote, supposedly how they represented that they supported. Other electors, states were awarded by district. There was a whole kind of patch quilt style of across the country of how electors were awarded. So in the election of 1796, you had Adams versus Jefferson. And Jefferson thought he would win the electors in his state. Adams thought he would win the electors in his and in New England. And Adams was able to poach a few electors from Jefferson's Virginia, and he won the presidency. Jefferson was unhappy with that, and so he discussed with the Virginia state legislature a means of changing how they awarded their electors. And so they came up with the winner-take-all rule. It says if the majority of the state, 50% plus one people, vote for a presidential candidate, then all the electors from that state would then go to that candidate. Well, by doing so, that made Virginia a very important state in the presidential campaign because you could get more electors from Virginia than going to any other state and campaigning in the districts or however else they had it arranged. So other states recognized that this tipped the balance of power, so to speak, in relevance during a presidential election. And so New York created a winner-take-all rule for their state. And by doing that, that sort of set this cascade of states following this policy to adopt winner-take-all, because it was a kind of a beggar thy neighbor sort of policy, right? If you did it, it was good for you, and it was bad for your neighbor, so your neighbor had to do it. And so we ended up where we are today, which is 48 states use winner-take-all, and we have Maine and Nebraska, which use a district apportionment method. The interesting thing is that the winner-take-all system, as it's currently constituted, is not in our Constitution, although we seem to have acclimated to it over the century here. Another fun fact is that James Madison recognized that this winner-take-all system created a regional power struggle and had the potential to do so, and he advocated a constitutional amendment in 1823 wanting to eliminate winner-take-all as an option. So we have the winner-take-all system today, and I would contend that this system it's created a broken system for us for several reasons. The first is it creates battleground states. Here you can see in 2012 and the 2016 election, these maps represent presidential visits or campaign events that were held in the states. And just as an aside here, one visit does not make you a battleground state. But 40 might, 23 might. You can see there's a select group of states that have become battleground, right? Where the question being is, will they vote one way or the other? You know, it's a 50-50 chance, right? So the campaigns focus their attention and their energies on these locations, right? The problem being is that there's a principle called the propinquity principle, and that's, I guess, our vocabulary word for the day, and that is that your proximity to somebody in political power affects their policy making, right? Because we only know what we're told, and so if you're mingling with somebody all day long and they have concerns or issues, and your job is to fix concerns and issues, it's likely that you'll be dealing with those issues because you're aware of them and they're in the front of your mind. When presidential candidates are running around the country making campaign promises, looking at crafting policy that will win them the election, this propinquity principle applies, right? And so we have to look and say, okay, well, where are they? Are they in Utah? Not so much, right? But they are in Florida, Pennsylvania, Colorado, other states. And so, so policy can be influenced by states who are in close proximity to presidential candidates. So let's look at some examples of policy that is dovetailed with battleground state politics. So in 2002, we had the creation of No Child Left Behind, right? We had a Republican president and House. We had a Democrat Senate. This was probably the largest intrusion into state education programs in 50 years. I mean, a very heavy hand from the federal government. And this was driven essentially by Ohio politics. If you talk to the campaign strategists in the 2000 campaign, they recognized that there were voters in certain parts and precincts of Ohio that this was a big issue for them. And Ohio was a close state. And so a policy is crafted to ameliorate the concerns of that area. We have Medicare Part D, 2003. We have a Republican president, House, and Senate. Sounds familiar. We have a $1 trillion federal program that is created under the administration to provide for pharmaceuticals for the elderly, right? The 2000 race was very close in Florida, and there are a lot of folks who would benefit from this kind of a program living in Florida. If we fast forward today, something a little bit more contemporary, you have the end of NAFTA and 2017 trade wars, right? We have a Republican president, a House, and a Senate, and we have the largest departure from free trade agreements in 25 years. And this is in part driven by Rust Belt politics, right? The states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin who've seen their manufacturing base and their factories erode. This policy and promises were needed in order to secure the support of those voters. So that's just a small demonstration of how the policy works with the campaign trail and how politics and policy kind of converge. If you look at other perks that battleground states get, they're twice as likely to get a natural disaster declaration. They're twice as likely to get federal waivers for programs like No Child Left Behind. They receive more federal grants and more federal grant money than non-battleground states. Okay, so I'm going to give a kind of a Utah, sort of a Utah example. In order to understand the magnitude of how that interface between presidential politics and policy, I'm going to take us back to the seeds of Utah history, which is in Missouri. So in 1819, Missouri and Maine became part of the Union. They came in as part of the Missouri Compromise. So Missouri was a slave state, Maine was a free state. And that, for a time, maintained that precarious balance between the North and the South. At the time, there were Mormon settlers that moved into Missouri in Jackson County. The Mormons were typically anti-slave in a slave state, and created some concern among the existing settlers who were there. Shortly after their arrival to Jackson County, they were basically ousted and asked to leave. There was a local government basically signed letters saying, "Hey, we're forming a militia, and we don't want you here." So they left. They went to Clay County, north of Jackson County, where they stayed temporarily. The Missouri legislature at that point determined to create two counties to segregate the Mormons and provide a kind of a safe harbor for them, and they created Davies and Caldwell County. which they then moved into and created the town of Far West and settled there. So there was about 12,000 Mormon settlers in Davies and Caldwell County. With more coming, they spilled out of those counties and began buying up land around there, which reignited tensions with local settlers. Things became so unhappy that the governor of Missouri wrote the what we call the Mormon Extermination Order, which would be Missouri Executive Order number 44. And in there, he basically gives General Clark permission to oust the Mormons by force. In the bold there, the Mormons must be treated as enemies and must be exterminated or driven from the state. So General Clark follows his orders, and he goes then to Far West, surrounds the city, basically cuts off supplies to it, and the local leaders come out of the city and say, okay, look, white flag, we surrender, what do we got to do? And General Clark says, okay, you got to be out of here by spring. We're not going to, if you're still here in the spring, we can't guarantee your safety. We mean business. So at that point, they picked up and left. It was the middle of winter, and moved to Illinois. So they left their land, their homes, many of their possessions behind, and those were basically just kind of absorbed and taken by the other local settlers. And if you did an inflation-adjusted analysis on the losses, the financial losses incurred by that exodus, it'd be about $25 million today. If you count for the value of log huts and axes and other things. So Joseph Smith, who led the Mormons out, went to President Van Buren in Washington, D.C., and had a personal meeting with him and said, hey, look, this isn't the American way, right? Our rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness have been trodden upon. We've been treated terribly. Missouri's a state in the Union, and we would like to have our grievances addressed. And it was an election year, and so President Van Buren had a couple things to say. And there's two quotes attributed to his response to Joseph Smith on this. He says, what can I do? I can do nothing for you. If I do anything, I shall come in contact with the whole state of Missouri. Or it's been quoted another way as saying, your cause is just, but I can do nothing for you. If I take up for you, I shall lose the vote of Missouri. And so here we have probably one of the most cynical political calculations being made on where support would be lost in doing the right thing. And Van Buren was right. He won Missouri in 1840. And so the bottom line is battleground state politics, or the way that we offer our electors in a winner-take-all system today, causes presidential candidates to get transactional with the states that they need support from. So how do we fix the problem? And that's why I'm proposing the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact as a solution to bad policy, right? So what is it? It's a compact among states. The Constitution permits us to compact. We are a member of other compacts with other states. We do so with Western states regarding water and a number of other issues. This would have us join a compact of states. What we would be agreeing to is that once we reached a group of 270 electoral votes within the compact, at that time, and only at that time and not before, would we agree to award our electors to the winner of the national popular vote in the race for the president. The compact members can come and go at will, so it's not a permanent thing. It's not a constitutional amendment. It preserves the Electoral College and uses it as a tool to affect these ends, while respecting the sovereignty that our founding fathers offered our states. So the advantages of this: one is every vote becomes relevant for president. Presently, with the battleground states, really those votes matter, and everyone else is taken for granted, right? Once you get 50+1, the game's over. You can put that state on your side. States that are above 53% right now are just considered, they're in my camp. They're not even really dealt with. If you're between 47 and 53% on your votes, you're considered a battleground state. So what would change is that there would be a margin of victory as a campaign strategy. So what matters now is not whether you just get that state and put it in your back pocket as yours, is that you need to get every vote you can from every state in order to guarantee your success as a presidential candidate. Because every vote now becomes relevant to that race, it's not just local considerations that are given, but rather broad and national considerations that are given, because that candidate has to appeal to as many people as possible, not just to a select group. So if you could imagine, a presidential candidate is probably not going to be able to visit every state 40 times, right, if every state becomes a battleground state. But what you will have is the presence of their campaign and the presence of their surrogates and their message being conveyed, throughout the country, and also that feedback, that propinquity, being offered to their campaigns to know what are the issues of that area, even those voters, to deal with, and the campaigns will be forced to then balance those issues as they hear them out across the country. So political capital, we talk about fundraising, and money for money's sake is not very important to me, but money is a proxy for political power and influence. It just is. And so in 2012, Utah raised about $11 million for the presidential campaign. We spent $0 here in Utah on that effort. That money was exported and spent in places like Ohio and Florida, where in Florida they spent $175 million debating and projecting the presidential message to those markets. So if you could imagine raising $11 million and then keeping it here for the purpose of debating who's going to be our next president and who we're going to vote for, in that instance, that money is probably going to flow to the state parties to a degree so that they can have get-out-the-vote efforts, and to local county parties so that they can have local get-out-the-vote efforts. And we probably wouldn't have a state political party that's in debt, right? It probably wouldn't be the case. So because this is a downstream change in the presidential election process, I mean, everything's connected. And so there would probably, this is, just kind of conjecture, but there would probably be some changes upstream in the nomination process because the rules of the game would change. And so the parties would then have to nominate candidates that would be most likely to win under the new rules. So, we don't know that past candidates even would have passed muster under this kind of a rule system. We just don't know that. We often see right now in presidential politics where candidates groom their resume in order to appeal most to battleground states. Like they might have a vacation home in Florida that they go and visit frequently, or they might own a business in another state, or things that put them in close proximity to these battleground markets presently. That would no longer really apply under a national popular vote system. And then the other issue, too, that we seem to be experiencing presently is a sort of crisis of illegitimacy that exists because there's a disconnect between the winner of the electoral votes and the winner of the national popular votes. This would eliminate that problem. And disadvantages, I can't think of any at the moment. So there are some common concerns, though. Okay. Under the national popular vote interstate compact, would Hillary Clinton have become president? That's the first question that, at least in my Republican district, I get asked, right? And then my answer to that is, we don't know. Because of the change in the rules, she might not even have been a candidate, right? We just don't know that. Also, Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton did not run national popular vote races. They ran an electoral vote race. And so if you ran a national popular vote race, you're going to have a lot different of a campaign strategy than you do just focusing in on a few niche states. Another concern is, would the MP national popular vote interstate compact encourage fraud? So that's a question that comes up because, right, every vote counts. If I can stuff ballots, then that helps my cause, right? Well, if we look at the current system with battleground states, we're talking thin margins of victory here, right? Like, we just need to get to 50+1 in a state, and if I'm 10,000 or 20,000 votes shy, if I stuff ballots, then maybe that's going to give me a little bit of an edge. And if it's enough, then I could flip a state. And if I could flip a battleground state, then I could flip a presidential election, right? So the margins on fraud can be fairly small in a battleground type scenario and make a big difference. In a national popular vote race where you're talking hundreds of millions of votes, the level of fraud would have to be so big that it would be conspicuous, right? And fraudsters don't want to be conspicuous. They want to lie low and preferably not go to jail. So in order to accomplish that sort of a feat would require an enormous effort and would very likely throw people in jail. So I believe that the likelihood of fraud just by using math, it seems, and the probability of incarceration, it seems very unlikely that fraud would become a major issue under this system. Okay, next question. National popular vote sounds like an amazing solution to our election problems. How do I sign up as a co-sponsor for Rep. Peterson's bill? All right. I'll pass the form around shortly. Okay, next concern. Wouldn't big cities dominate elections under the national popular vote interstate compact system? And that's the intuitive, your gut check says, yes, of course. That's how that would work. But if you actually look at the population breakdown on where people live, 1/6 of our population lives in big cities. 1/6 of our population lives in very rural areas. And I would say Utah's got some of those. And then small towns, medium towns, suburbs, everyone else lives in between there. So it's a fairly, it's not as concentrated and bifurcated as we would initially think, just based on the data. So the data seems to refute that. Now, people would say, well, you could just market to a big city and ignore the rural areas in your marketing. And I would say look at your own campaigns, right? Like when you go campaign, do you ignore a certain precinct or a certain area of your district because you can spend your time and money in another area and get more votes than another? No, you pay attention to the whole area. No, you don't? Okay, well, I will not name names. I see heads shaking. Okay, well, let's take a look at how Governor Herbert runs his campaigns. Right, he goes to the rural areas.
Representative?
Yeah.
We've allocated 15 minutes to this, and you've gone on 25 minutes. We've got a full agenda.
It feels like 2.
I know.
So
if you could kind of wrap this up. in the next 5 minutes, that would be great.
Okay, great. So notable supporters: Newt Gingrich, Howard Dean, former Senator Garn. Quotable quotes. So this is my last slide before questions and answers, which I know you guys all have. There was a senator in Pennsylvania, and they had proposed at the state legislature to eliminate their winner-take-all rule. And he says, Pennsylvania is a battleground state. It gets a ton of attention, a ton of resources. The day this bill passes, we become irrelevant to electoral campaigns. We become Utah on the day this bill passes. So, you know, this is out there. This is how battleground states feel, and we know how we feel as a non-battleground state. And with that, Mr. Co-Chair, I'll take any questions anyone has.
Thank you. And that previous statement was made with love.
Yeah, I feel the love. I feel the love. We're good. We're good.
Okay, to the committee, are there any questions on this issue? This is a report and proposal. We do not have a bill before us. Any comments or questions? Okay, Senator DeBackus.
I'll be brief. I know we have many other ones. I just have a quick point of clarification that Representative Aaron brought up, which is when you speak about state parties being in great debt, I just want to clarify which state party, or if there is one, because there is one that has not a dime's debt. So
you got a 50-50 chance of that.
Thank you, Senator.
Look, I don't do this very often, but and I might be ruled out of order if I give you a standing ovation, but I want to give you a sitting ovation. I love this bill, and anything I can do, including oppose it to help it pass, I'll be there. Thank you.
Okay. Oh, that's good. Thank you, Senator. Appreciate that. Okay, Representative, is there anybody who you wanted to have speak to this, or is that just your presentation?
In the interest of time, let's just have, if we should have a show of hands of those who came to support the bill today.
Okay, yeah, support, okay. Anyone opposed? Okay, we got all right, that's good. Okay.
Okay, great. Well, that concludes my presentation. If anyone has any other questions, I'd be glad to answer them.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. One more. Representative Sempe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't want to let the opportunity go without making a comment here, because I think while I agree with probably 95% of the presentation in terms of context and problems that we face in the state of Utah, I completely disagree with the solution proposed. And the reason is, my concern is the concept of a national popular vote is a bit of a misnomer in my mind in this specific proposal. And the reason is because we are wrapping the Electoral College into the national popular such that Utah, well, so one of the things that came up, I think, was, would Clinton have won the election last year? We don't know. I agree, we don't know. But what we do know is with this proposal, the Utah votes would have been cast essentially for Clinton because she was the national popular vote winner. And that dynamic, to me, disenfranchises voters potentially. And I don't care if it was, in the example last year, if Trump had won the national popular vote, and Utah had wanted McMullen, for instance, hypothetically, and he had gotten most votes in Utah for McMullen, the Utah votes would have gone for Trump. And I just feel like that's a potential problem of disenfranchising voters moving forward. And so I have concerns of the current proposal and the way it's currently structured.
May I respond to that?
Go ahead.
So, and I hear that. I hear what you're saying. It's unsavory, or it feels unsavory to say that our state voted for someone and yet our electoral votes go to somebody else. But what we're doing is a trade, right? What we're trading is actual political engagement and attention and proximity for the potential to have that happen. Where right now, we don't receive any of that attention, right? Our proximity is minimal and our influence is minimal at most. And so it is, I admit, it is a trade-off, right? We are trading that relevancy for the prospect that if it doesn't go our way, our electoral votes go to somebody else. And so in my eyes, that trade-off is worth it, although we all have different opinions on that.
So, Mr. Chair, if I may, I don't see that as a trade-off because I don't think we'll get the result that we hope for. I think the focus for the presidential elections will shift away from battleground states in terms of where the vote may be close, and it'll shift to the most population-dense areas. I think that's where campaigns would get the most bang for their buck, is focusing on the most population-dense areas. And once again, Utah would become relatively irrelevant because we have a smaller population.
Yeah, and if there are examples, if you look at like Tim Pawlenty or George Pataki in their races for governors in their relative states, they got crushed in the cities. I mean, they lost in the cities, but they won because the rural vote came out to support them. And so, I mean, if you look at dollars spent, it's expensive to market in an urban market, but rural marketing on radio waves, TV is very inexpensive. And so I think you would see, it would balance out, that there would be interest across the board, not just in urban markets, but in every place.
So those are my concerns. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Appreciate you sharing those. Representative Ivory.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just echo and agree with what Representative Sampe said. Just some other points. It eliminates the states as electoral districts. I mean, it nationalizes policy. We're already finding a nationalization of policy where we're losing our governing voice that was intended to be divided into areas so that we have efficiency, effectiveness, accountability at the most local level. This is the very opposite of that. We've made changes to how we elect the president a number of times in our nation, and it's been by amendments to the Constitution. You know, George Washington said in his parting counsel in the farewell address, said, if the distribution or modification is ever wrong in any particular, let it be changed by an amendment the way the Constitution designates, but not by usurpation any other way. He says that's how free government is destroyed. And so the issue of federalism that we were just talking about, it completely weakens that, because we're taking that division of power, division of voice, and throwing it all into one because we want some kind of attention and popularity contest. We want people to spend money and pay attention to us during a presidential election, when our system was designed that we didn't want the pendulum of the president deciding everything one way or the other. We have a pendulum where Trump is now deciding a bunch of things, and 3 years from now that pendulum may swing wildly back the other way. Our system was designed to moderate all of that by having the bulk of things that affect our lives be decided where people have a voice. They can come like this to a hearing and have input and meet with representatives and have accountability in what's happening. So I think it's structurally very much at odds with the system that we have, and agree with the comments that Representative Sampe made. So,
Representative Ivory, you would be more supportive of constitutional amendment than of this process? Is that what you're stating?
Well, I don't like the solution at all. I think the solution is misguided. But if we're going to have a discussion about making a change, that's the area where you make that discussion. That's the way that we've already set in our governing documents. That's how we would make such a change.
Okay. Thank you. Senator Dayton.
Thank you. I realize you're trying to tie this discussion up, so I will not speak except to say that since one comment from the Senate has already been made in favor of this, I would like to make sure that there's a comment from the Senate opposing this. I align myself with the comments that Representative Sampea said, and also Ivory.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Thank you, Representative Peterson. We'll go on to the next item of the agenda. I think we will see this in the session, and I believe that we'll have additional dialogue on this, offline as well. So you've got a little bit of work ahead of you, but thank you all for coming and for bringing this issue up. It has passed in a number of states, and the proposal is being considered by others.